Okay, yesterday I used 2 different types of flour to make the bread. And today, let's talk about the bread, how it tastes, the consistency, the whole 9 yards. I moved it because originally I had the bread flour on the opposite side, but this loaf is using bread flour. This loaf is using all-purpose flour. They both taste identical. It's the same recipe. The only thing I did different was I used bread flour over the other. Now, when this was rising, when the bread flour was rising in the bowl, it was actually taller. But when I punched it down, put it back in the oven or in the pan to get ready to put in the oven, and then you actually let it sit for another hour and a half, the second time it didn't get bigger while in the loaf pan. This one was actually smaller. Well, close. It was actually close to what this one was when it was in the pan, in the bowl rising, but while it was cooking, it got bigger. Okay? But this is the all-purpose flour. I used King Arthur. There's a piece of the bread. Try to move here so you don't see the... And then this one is the bread flour. They're both, I feel like they're both very dense. Ed loved it. He doesn't like a bread that has a lot of holes and is light in feeling. He is taking both to work, and I'm asking the guys at work to kind of chime in. So if I think about it and enough of the guys give me their honest opinion, I can come back and tell you. Guys, this was the same exact recipe. It was just 2 different types of flour. Now, like I said, the one on the left is the bread flour, and that one, while it was rising, was taller. But once I punched it down, actually split it, because the recipe I had, you were supposed to go ahead and let it sit and rise for an hour and a half. And then you punched it down, kneaded it very lightly, just enough to where you could get it to where you could cut it and split it so you could make 2 loaves out of the dough. And then I put one back in, I put half of that back in the loaf pan. And then I did the same exact with this one here and put it in the loaf pan. The all-purpose on the right wasn't as big during the first rise, but while baking, it got bigger. And I'm not real sure because, like I said, I used the same exact bread recipe as I did for the other. So, and I literally did everything the same. The recipe that I used here, the ingredients was 1 package of active dry yeast, 2 1/4 cups of warm water between 110 to 115 degrees, 3 tablespoons of sugar plus half a teaspoon of sugar, 1 tablespoon of salt, 2 tablespoons canola oil, and 6 1/4 to 6 3/4 cups of bread flour. I did 6 3/4 cup bread flour, but if I do it again, I would only do the 6 1/4. In a large bowl, I dissolved the yeast and half a teaspoon of the sugar in warm water. I let it stand in 2 different bowls until the bubbles formed on the surface, which both did equally just as well. I whisked together remaining 3 tablespoons sugar, salt, and 3 cups flour. I stirred in the oil into the yeast mixture. Actually, no, I did not do it that way. I put the yeast mixture, I didn't do that, I didn't do that until I added the yeast mixture into the flour. So I guess I didn't do that, but I don't think that would have made any difference. I poured the flour and the mixture all together. I actually just used my hands to stir until it was smooth. I did the flour, I added the rest of the flour, and I used my hands for that. I started to whisk it, and then I just said, nah, I'll use my hands. I turned the flour on a surface and kneaded until smooth and elastic and for 8 to 10 minutes. Placed in a grease bowl, turning once to grease the top. Covered and let rise until doubled, and both of them did double. They sat for 1.5 to 2 hours according to the directions. I let it sit for 2 hours. I made sure I turned up the heat just a bit because it was very cold and windy the other night. I punched the dough down, turned on a lightly floured surface, divided half, shaped into loaves, and placed into 2 greased loaf pans. I actually ended up doing 4 loaves total. Cover and let rise again once you put it in the loaf pan for another 1.5 hours, 1 to 1.5 hours. I went ahead and mine rose for 1.5 hours because I was folding laundry. Bake at 375 until golden brown, and bread sounds hollow when tapped or has reached an internal temperature of 200. I just went ahead and I time it. I actually set my timer for 15 minutes, and then I spin it around, and then I set a timer for another 15. And then, of course, I dumped it out of the loaf pans to cool on the racks. So that is the directions. That is the ingredients. They were very easy. I've done a lot of bread, and Ed loves this one because he loves the thickness of it. And when I say thickness, I mean, it's not bad. It's still nice and soft. It has a good flavor. It has a nice texture. I put jam on a piece, and I thought it was amazing. I tasted both, and honestly, I liked it equally. So there you go. The only difference between these two, and both were King Arthur flour, by the way. King Arthur bread flour, King Arthur all-purpose flour. So I used both recipes for both breads. The only difference was the flour. One was bread flour on the left, and the right was the all-purpose flour. So I also have a bread machine. I normally use the bread machine, and I do actually love using the bread machine because I could throw bread together so quick. And then the bread machine does all the proofing and the rising and all that fun stuff. But I just wanted to try this. So the difference between King Arthur and all-purpose, other than the all-purpose got bigger in the oven, was nothing. Other than the difference in height, they both feel equally as heavy. The one on the right doesn't feel any heavier than the one on the left. And they both have the same flavor. Now, I make a honey bread, and I kind of wished I would have added just a little bit of honey into this, but I may show you guys that recipe here soon. So anywho, there's really, if you're on a budget and you don't want to buy and spend that little bit, that smidge extra on bread flour, you'd be just as fine just to go ahead and buy all-purpose. I prefer King Arthur, but I think it just depends on preference and pricing and where you are, and what's available to you. So hope that helps, guys. Have a great one, and go make some bread while you're isolated. Bye. Oh, hit like, hit subscribe.